character in the book of Genesis at this point. And we've seen some of his character early on where he buys Esau's birthright for a bowl of soup. And then we see his deception and his scheming, which is not about to end. Whenever he sneaks in and takes the blessing, usurps the blessing that Isaac was going to give Esau as the oldest son. So we're starting to see a little bit about him, and that really set the last week's study in motion, where Esau, after having been fleeced by Jacob, gets angry, and word gets around that I'm going to kill my brother once my father dies. Rebekah finds out, says we gotta get Jacob out of here to safety until he cools off a little bit. And so under the pretense, and maybe not so much under the pretense, but one, to keep Jacob safe, and two, so Jacob doesn't marry among the Canaanites, they send him back to her family in Haran to find a wife and also to allow Esau some time to cool off. While there, Jacob, he gets fleeced himself, thinking he's going to Rachel after 7 years of working for his uncle Laban. He ends up deceitfully finding himself married to Leah. And he's not happy about that, but what goes around comes around. So he says, I'll work another 7 years for your other daughter, your youngest daughter, Rachel, which he goes ahead after fulfilling Leah's week, takes Rachel as his wife, and then works another 7 years for Laban. In the midst of that, there's a lot of turmoil going on in that family, and several children are produced, both through Leah, Zilpah, Bilhah. Those are the two maidservants of the daughters. And then finally, as we come to the conclusion of last week's study, Rachel is remembered by God, and she gives birth to her first son, Joseph. So that's really where we left things off, and kind of picking up in the middle of Jacob's stay with his brother, and going to kind of see a transition now as he's worked for his wives, now he's going to work for his wealth. That's going to be how we begin tonight's study. We'll start that off here in just a moment, but before we do, we'll have a word of prayer to ask God's blessing on our study. Danny, if you would, please.
Beautiful day you guys. Opportunity to come together to study that word, learn from the Bible, and just knowing how, according to some people that serve God and found favor in God, had their struggles. We just realize we are weak and sinful, and we rely on you. Always, whatever we do, put our faith in you and try to always be faithful and put our trust in you. You've got a plan for us to work out for us. We just thank you for teachers, Jack, Mike, our class, the other teachers. Pray that you will give them what they need to have a remembrance of the things that they made us pray. We're just so thankful for being and women that are willing to teach, and thankful for our group here, the young people we have. We're really blessed, Lord, young and old. Young are the future of the church, and be a good influence. Stay strong and faith. Thank you, Lord, for all your blessings.
Amen. So just a couple quick words before we get into our lesson. Danny, thank you for that prayer. And I always appreciate, as someone who is teaching or preaching, the warnings in Scripture about the significance of that and the weight of that. I always appreciate the prayers on behalf of me whenever I'm speaking to God's people from God's Word. But something I'm thankful for is the students. I can tell a lot of you spend time, and those of you who comment and share the things from you that you've studied. I appreciate the time you're taking to spend in preparing for that, because you teach me, and I learn from you whenever you share those things. And I know that there's a lot more studying that goes on. Some of us just may not be comfortable commenting. I'm thankful for the hard work that this congregation puts in to studying and preparing, and the knowledge that manifests in the comments you make. One last thing. I guess it was last Sunday night, we'd mentioned David Haley and his the very serious condition that he was in. There have been a few updates on that. I don't know what's been said or not, but since we mentioned this publicly and asked for prayers on his behalf, I thought I'd go ahead and let you know. Things do seem to be going in a better direction for him. I actually talked to him today. He called me. So just the Lord has heard and answered our prayers and certainly shown mercy to him. We just didn't really know what was going to happen, but he seems to be headed in the right direction. He's not out of the woods, so please don't stop praying on his behalf. But God has certainly seemed to intervene and seem to have taken things in a better direction for him. So continue to pray for him and for his family. Just wanted to give you that quick update. I know that you'd appreciate that. It's always encouraging to see God at work in the life of his people. So anyway, with that being said, begin our Bible study.
All right, so Zach had mentioned last week we kind of wrapped up the end of the 14 years. And how many children had Jacob had? We'll just say Jacob because his wife, Leah, and the two maidservants has had children. And then at the end of the lesson last week, Rebecca had Joseph. So how many children did that make that they've had in 7 years, basically?
I smell a trick question.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So they've had
12, right?
Yeah, they've had the
Dinah.
11 sons and Dinah. So that would be 12 total. So and they've had those in the 7 years because remember the first 7 he worked and then he got Leah, and then as Zach said a week later he got Rachel. So then they started having the babies. So in the last 7 years they've had that we know of 12 that they've named. And as Zach said last week, there's probably more daughters in this family that's just not named, but Dinah was named because we're going to see her appear again just a little bit later. So tonight we're wrapping up those terms, and Jacob is kind of ready to take his family and head back home. And so God comes to him in a prayer and tells him, hey, it's time for you to wrap up and head home. We start to study tonight, and he gets ready to go, and he goes to Laban and says, hey, I've done everything that you've asked me, and it's time for me to leave. And then Laban kind of tricks him again. So what kind of person was Laban? How would y'all label or characterize Laban as a person? Okay.
I think that's a really
Okay.
good term.
Yeah.
Really a lot like his son-in-law, ain't he? Maybe older and wiser and sneakier.
Yeah, right. But
He's been playing the game longer than Jacob had, so.
yeah. So he's kind of deceptive and conniving. We've seen unethical behavior. We've seen it all in the last few lessons with everybody. And so tonight, we're trying to wrap that up, transition Jacob into being a better person. And so, but as far as I can tell, since Jacob has been there, I mean, he seemed to have been doing the right things because God seemed to have been blessing him. Because that was one of the reasons Laban didn't want him to leave. He said, because, while you're here, your God has blessed you and blessed all. I have flourished, basically. My livestock's strong. Everything's been good while you've been here. So I could see from Laban's perspective why he didn't want Jacob to leave. Yes, ma'am. Mike.
People around them like black magic or something like that, and gave God the credit for it. But if he was stealing, he wasn't doing it in an ethical manner. I don't know that it was coming from God. The blessing was, but he was giving God the glory. But he was doing it. If he was doing it deceitfully, and God was blessing him anyway, because maybe that just proves that God blesses people sometimes even when they're sinners and they're not doing right and they don't do it the right way. Just like he blessed Abraham and Sarah with a son, even though they tried to fix it their way. He still blessed
Okay.
I think you're exactly right that God blesses people, and I think he did that with Jacob. He blesses Jacob in spite of Jacob, right? Jacob really isn't deserving of all of this when you look at how he's acted and the kind of behavior he's demonstrated. We're going to see we're going to see a shift. We're going to see a shift with him where he begins to move in the right direction toward God, but he hadn't gotten there yet. He's going to progress much further in the next couple of lessons. That's an interesting comment. We know regarding Laban, if you look, I think it's in verse 27, Laban comes to Jacob and says, I've learned from divination that God has blessed me because of you. And so we know that Laban is a pagan and an idolater. Also, we're going to find that out a little bit later on. Now, that's an interesting observation, though, because whenever we get a little further into the text, I had a couple of thoughts on that as to what exactly was Jacob doing with those sticks, because it's odd, right? And so you say you read some things that seem to indicate that may have been like some sort of paganistic practice that he was using to bring about this. Okay, all right. I hadn't heard that. I had some thoughts on the sticks, but but we'll talk about that because I think it's relevant in the story a little later on. But as far as I know Laban was involved in that kind of pagan stuff. I don't know that Jacob was, but I suppose it's possible that if that was something he picked up, from the people of the land, that may have been what he was doing. But I think you were right when you said God was the one behind all of that and his increasing.
Yeah,
Certainly he's not though the example that of faithfulness and trustworthiness. Though that being said,
yeah. I had read it was a culture thing back then that they had. It seemed to do that more than a paganistic thing. It was just a kind of a culture thing with some of the farmers.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I with all I read, I didn't take it that he was skimming off the top, so to speak, or stealing. So I'm glad you said that. I'm gonna go back and read more on that because I read a lot into it trying to figure it out.
Since we're talking about the sticks, and all of that, and for those who you get a little further in the story, what's going to happen? Jacob's going to say, okay, I'll stay, but I want wages. What are you going to pay me? And Laban says, what will keep you here? And Jacob says, give me a portion of the flock. And I think he says the speckled and the spotted among the cattle, and the black colored among the sheep. I think that's what he said. Anyway, he says all of the ones that you've got now that are like that, I'll take them and we'll move them away, and I'll keep your flock, and your sons can. Laban's sons are actually going to keep Jacob's. So anyway, all of that happens, and you get a little further on the story. Do you want to talk kind of about how that progresses?
Yeah, I can.
Okay,
Yeah,
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead and
that's
just
kind of where we're at on question one.
That's where we're working.
We'll get
working at.
into that. So they, they have this conversation about the wages, and then Laban thinks he's getting a good deal when I think when Joseph starts telling him his plan about the spotted animals, because there are just not that many of them. It's kind of rare. So he's thinking, okay, he's doing it to himself this time instead of me kind of taking over or cheating him. He's kind of setting himself up. But think back to May's point, he had a plan in that when he took these. He already had a plan, and I think we'll see in 31 that God had already told him in that dream about the stripes and the stuff. So I think that's kind of maybe where he got it from too. But back to that. So what was his wages when Laban asked him, what will your wages be if you work for me for 6 more years? And that is, as Zach said, that was the animals, and that was how he was going to start his herd, and then start multiplying his. So again, as I said, I think Laban, I think he thought that he's just won the jackpot because he's going to get basically 6 years of free labor, and when it's all over, Jacob's still going to be short. He's not going to multiply as much as he thinks he is. Any other thoughts on that?
Laban changes his wages 10 times.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like specifically in his speech later is that, all right, speckled, spotted, black right now. But
Right.
It's like he said, all right, nope, speckled. And when that happened, God had the flock move speckled. No, spotted.
Yeah.
And it looked like that happened. It reduced from that original agreement and changed.
Yeah, he shifted it on when he realized that Jacob's flock was growing and his was diminishing, and so it seems like he probably changed to what it was growing to, and then God in turn would overturn that. So, as to the sticks, Jacob takes those sticks and he puts them out there when the animals are breeding, and carves into them the stripes and all of that. I think the bottom line is Jacob's still trying to be a self-made man. That rather than entrusting the Lord, he's trying to do something, either something superstitious, or I read that he's 90-something years old at this point, so he's not a young guy. He kept his father's flocks. He probably understood a fair amount about breeding and those sort of things, and so he may have just understood genetics better than we might give him credit for that time. And the sticks were kind of just something to throw Laban's sons off his trail. If they were wondering, well, why does this keep happening? So, there's all kind of speculation on that. But it seems at the bottom of it, Jacob's still trying to be a self-made man, when in actuality, God's the one that's blessing him. So
That's right. And another thing I read, there's actually a breed of sheep today called Jacob sheep, and they think it came from that generational thing, but still read. But one of the other things that I read was it was uncommon for there to be the spotted and speckled, that mostly everything on the eastern side was the solid colors. So that was why there was just so few of them, and how they got in the genetics of the spotted and the speckled and the browns, I don't know. But I guess it's like anything, you can take with cattle. I have black cows and black bulls, and the last couple of years, I've had red calves out of them, where they come from. But they come from a bloodline somewhere through there, so.
you haven't been carving those sticks and putting them out by the water, have you?
That's it. Yeah, that's it. Any other thoughts on question one there?
Andrew?
Just that in this agreement, right after the agreement, Jacob intentionally puts 3 days distance
Mhm.
between. Jacob is taking the speckled, spotted, whatever. He's actually removing them from Laban's flock, which he's still caring for,
Mhm.
but it's 3 days away. So later when the sun starts complaining, they visited, saw what his possessions was like, because they didn't have a day-to-day assessment of that, or visibility.
Yeah.
And we need to make sure he Laban's son, and taking care of.
I'm sorry.
In the beginning, what Andrew was talking about, in the beginning, when they moved them 3 days away, separated them, they taken care of. So what are you mixing?
Right. Yeah. All right, so that kind of, then what happened during Jacob's time with Laban? Of course, his flocks grew exceedingly. And then we get into the next part. What did God tell Jacob to do in a dream? Okay. So, and that's kind of catching us up to what we've talked about so far. He come to him in that dream, told him to go back to his native land, and then what did he do? He took all of his flocks, his children, his wives, and put them, out and sent them on their way. And during that time, had another interesting thing that starts taking place. And after they left, and apparently when Laban comes back and realizes they're gone, and he gets very angry. And I guess at that time he also saw that his little idols were gone. And so he starts chasing after him. And
Yeah, and that was, who was it that took the idols? Rachel? Yeah. Now, I'm interested to hear y'all's thoughts on this. Why do you think she took them? Habit? In what sense? Oh, okay. All right. So those, yeah. Okay. So those were her gods, and she wanted to be in possession of them, maybe? Possibly? Okay, I think that's within the realm of possibility. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, just in case. Hedge your bets. Get as many gods. Can't have too many gods helping you out, right? case this one lets me down, these others, maybe they'll pick up the slack. Polytheism, I mean, that's really what's at its core is, all of these different things, and that's where, true, true faith is God over everything rather than, God over this or that or the other, like in all of the pantheons that exist. I see. Okay. Yep. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm gonna get something out of this. I'm not leaving empty-handed. Yeah, they whenever Jacob consults them, his wives, as to, hey, this is what God told me. What do you think we should do? They're like, hey, he's used up our inheritance. He sold us. If God told you to go, let's go. And Rachel's like, I'll take these on my way out the door. And I think there is something too, perhaps culturally to that time, that would have placed Jacob as being the possessor of them, as kind of in this prosperous position, or giving him some sort of inheritance rights that might have, she could have used that later to have gained further wealth for her family. So, Luke?
Right. Look at verse 14 and 15. Do we have any portion or inheritance of our father's house?
Mm-hmm.
Are we not counted with him as foreigners?
Yeah.
And so, to me, this is an act of spite. She knows he loves them. Obviously, the previous time, the catch up about the omen, he has respect for his idols.
Mm-hmm.
And he thinks they have done him well. He didn't care for us. Hey, we're going to take everything we can.
Yeah. To that point, I read something that said she thought he might be able, through divination, to ascertain where they were going, and so by taking them, she's kind of covering that trail where he can't discover. The Jews have an actually interesting interpretation on this, and I think it may be just they're trying to view Rachel in the most favorable light, but they say that she might have taken them so that her father might not worship the idols anymore. So
I don't think that's it.
yeah, I don't think that was the case either. But
She might have been afraid that Laban was going to take it too.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe so.
Yep.
So it seems like, to me, it seems like there's still some activity.
there is.
Yeah.
Whatever
There is.
among.
That's right.
I think that's true, and it's not just the idols that they dispose of, right? There are other religious jewelry and things like that he tells them to get rid of. May? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think Laban's a good picture of that. And to Luke's point, you think about, I think probably both of these sisters tend to be a bit spiteful just due to the circumstances that they were living in. So that is like, we'll just kick them on the way out the door kind of thing. So, Philip?
Everything we think about right now, certainly on faith, we really know. We are looking at it. Guy, Christian today,
Mm-hmm.
we've got God written. We can see that. They didn't have that. And all they can sort of go by is, Rachel could only go by what her husband said. See, that he's being prosperous and things like that. It's a patriarch
Mm-hmm.
that God has spoken to him. But I don't think God is speaking to him daily. And so it has to be a gradual thing for Rachel to leave things that she used to as far as God, things like that. And hold on to it, probably.
Yeah.
But that's speculation. That's something she used to.
Well, Leah didn't take them. So I think this tells us something about Rachel, as to her character and her interest in her faith, or or lack of faith in God. And in contrast to Rachel, who takes the idols, family idols, you have Rebecca, who leaves it all behind, and says, I'll put my faith in Yahweh, and I'll bind my fate to this family. because of her faith in God. So certainly Rachel seems to have struggle letting go of days gone by, and maybe her connection to them personally, or maybe it was nothing more than spite. So it. I'm sure they could have been, but I don't know that monetary. I mean, I guess her purposes in taking them could have been monetary, but I think more so in connection to their blessing, and how they might benefit her family. Yeah. I mean, that's true. I mean, it could be any, all, none of these things, So a lot of good thoughts on that. But anyway, Jacob realizes he's not on good terms with Laban because Laban's flock's diminished, Jacob's flock's grown, and so he says, Laban's off shearing his sheep, we're going to get out of here, we're going to start the trip back. So they start heading back to that, and 3 days later, Laban finds out that Jacob snuck off in the night and taken his daughters and grandchildren with him, and he gathers up his men, and they pursue Jacob and end up catching him several days later. And here's God protecting Jacob again. Whenever they finally do catch up, the night before they arrive, God comes to Laban in a dream. What does he tell him? Yeah. So, yeah. So don't say anything bad. You better not do anything to hurt them. But at the same time, don't entice them to come back either. Don't say anything good to them either. Don't try to make a better deal with them and entice them and bring them back, because it was God who came to him and said, it's time to go back. Time to go back to the promised land. So Laban said, he pretty much tells him, Jacob's going, he's going with my blessing, and I'm protecting him. So don't threaten him. Don't try to draw him back. Don't try to entice him again to come back. And so he catches up with Jacob the next day, and he says, why'd you run off in the middle of the night? Don't you know if you would have told me, I'd have thrown you a going away party. And we know that wasn't the case, right? Because they weren't on good terms. There was some jealousy and envy taking place between the two families, and that's why Jacob snuck off in the night. He knew how his uncle would probably respond. But then he asked him, why did you steal my gods? I would have gave you a party when you left, but why did you take my gods? Adding insult to injury. So Jacob says, I didn't take your gods. Whoever you find the gods with, their life will be forfeit. And so Laban then begins to look around and goes from place to place, doesn't find them. Comes to Rachel's tent. She's the one that's got them. And she begs off. She's sitting down on the whatever blankets that she's riding on for a camel, and she says, I can't get up, I'm the way of women's with me, so forgive me for not standing up. So she's sitting on top of him, hiding them, and he looks around, doesn't find them, and leaves. Luke, do you want to?
Self-service and a lot of things that underhanded to the that goes on. And so it's about what kind of relationship we have today. And I think that overlook that family dynamic and how just ugly they were to each other and the way they treated each other. So there's a lot of animosity built up and have been going on for years.
Yeah.
And the whole situation with Rachel and Leah is because of Laban.
Mm-hmm.
The whole debacle of the wives is because of Laban. And so there's going to be hurt feelings there, and just a level of emotion that is hard to gather just from reading about it.
Yeah.
And Laban's not worried about it. It said that he spent all of Rachel and Leah's money.
Yeah. Wonder what that means. I mean, I don't know if it's just like bad investments or what, but that's what they say is, he's wasted our inheritance.
Yeah.
So certainly that's something to appreciate as we're going through here, is the envy and the jealousy and just the general bad feeling, which is very much not what God wants within families, not within immediate families, not within extended families. And it all goes back, as we said last week, to God has this plan and this pattern for marriage, and they deviated from that, and they're reaping the consequences of it. Crawford?
Ancient culture Rachel is so worried about her family name and her inheritance that she steals the idols. And then Laban is so worried about him losing his family name that he runs after them 3 days journey. So I think it's kind of cool to see that dynamic.
Yeah, I think that's something we probably don't consider, just in the culture vastness that separates us and them, and how that was very much honor was very much something part of that they emphasized. It was a significant part of their culture and motivated them in ways that we oftentimes can't comprehend.
But that's a good point, Luke. I've seen families recently divided when it come down to parents passing, and then you start splitting things up, and brothers and sisters just not even speak to each other anymore on account of that. So selfish greed shouldn't be amongst Christians, but I mean, I've seen it, and I know y'all have too, when it gets in situations like that. And I think that's a very important lesson that we could learn from this study. Okay.
Let's sum up chapter 31 real quick. I mean, we could spend more time talking about all of these details, but we've got some pretty significant events that are going to occur a little bit later on. So after Laban doesn't find the idols, Jacob's had this pent-up anger at his father-in-law that it just seems like it's the exit interview, if you will. All of the beef that he had been holding in, he kind of lets Laban have up to this point in time. And so after this, they make a covenant of peace. I guess you could call it a covenant of peace. Kind of a couple of comments that I thought summarized it pretty well. It's they place this memorial here, and they pretty much say, hey, I won't cross over to do you harm. You don't cross over to do me harm. And Laban says, God's going to be watching over you whenever you leave to make sure that you don't take other wives and that you treat my daughters right. And the God of Abraham, Nahor, and Terah judge between us. So pretty much just, it's not a good relationship. And they set this thing up that says, hey, you stay on your side, I'll stay on mine. Okay, don't cross over and mess with me. I won't cross over and mess with you. So finally, Jacob is able to depart. And that's where we get to chapter 32, where now probably what he's been dreading since the moment that he left, the time to confront Esau, who was ready to kill him, as word was 20 years ago. Lance? Mm-hmm.
God of Abraham, God of
Mm-hmm.
now explained by
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a fair observation. In fact, you can. It seems like Terah probably worshipped him as well, who was Abram and Nahor's father. That being said, we also see that they were polytheistic. So while they would have worshipped Yahweh, and you'll remember whenever Abraham's servant comes to bring Rebekah back, find the wife for Isaac, whenever they hear all of the things that transpired, they both Bethuel and Laban say this is of the Lord. So they recognize Yahweh's involvement in that. But they didn't worship Yahweh alone, which that's the first commandment, that's going to emerge from that. You shall have no other gods before me. Yahweh is a jealous God, so he doesn't share his honor with any others. And so that was one of the clear mistakes. But that being said, better than the Canaanites who had no knowledge of the one true God, right? And so there are remnants of truth within this family, and so certainly a better stock to take from than the Canaanites. So there would be some fear of God among these people, and they would know some of God's working, although there would be some things that needed to be purged, and we're going to see Jacob taking care of that later. All right. Mike, you have any thoughts on this section here in chapter 32?
I'm ready to go.
All right.
All right, so we pick up in 32. We're coming into where he's fixing to meet up and have an opportunity to see Esau again. How does that go? I do. This is, to me, is probably the best story that we've had in a long time. We're kind of wrapping up now. That kind of gives you some cold chills, and it gives you that good warm feeling of how situations or relationship, when they're divided, should be able to come back together. And so this is kind of the best part of the lessons that we've had here in the last few weeks. So you think Jacob had any anxiety Oh, man, yeah.
He was terrified, wasn't he?
Yeah. It's the last time that he left, Esau, and of course he's had 20 years, saying that time has a way of healing broken feelings or wounds. So hopefully that 20 years he's been able to do that. And it seems like from reading the story that Esau has prospered some through those times too, because when Jacob comes to him to give him some stuff, he said, "Hey, I don't need it. I've got, I've got plenty." And but Jacob wanted him to have it and went ahead and gave it to him. And so, how does Esau come to Jacob when he sees him? Y'all remember? Yeah. And what does Jacob do when he sees Esau? He bows and bows and bows. That's right. I mean, he bows 7 times, it said, when he saw Esau. I guess that's a thing of humility to me. That's how I see that. Y'all may, that,
No,
I think that's just showing his humility and
maybe a little bit healthy does fear too.
yeah, that might have been
Well,
some of it.
yeah, and that was, he doesn't know how Esau's going to receive him. And as has been pointed out, we have the story. We know what's going to happen. We know Esau's going to put the past in the past and forgiving Jacob, right? But the word that Jacob gets is Esau's coming to meet you, and he's got 400 men. And so Jacob, the last he heard from his brother was, "I'm going to kill him." And so you can't blame the guy for being a little bit fearful. There is one significant event that we do want to make mention of that occurs. That's chapter 33, where you have the reunion. But there is one significant event in chapter 32. Well, there's a couple. He kind of divides his party up and sends them across the river. And that night, Jacob ends up wrestling with an angel. Okay, and so it seems to be quite the tussle. And truthfully, that is wrestling is the story of Jacob's life, is it not? He wrestles with his brother. He's wrestled with his father over the blessing. He's wrestled with his uncle Laban over the flock and over, his care and his work. And now he's wrestling. He's been wrestling God all along, but it really manifests here in this moment where he's wrestling this angel. And I don't know. This particular angel says, "Hey, the day's breaking. You got to let me go." I think there was more to it than that. Some people have looked at this and said, "Wow, Jacob must be really strong to have been able to successfully wrestle an angel." That angel could have gotten loose anytime he wanted. Okay, and there's more going on than that. And so it's, "Let me go." And Jacob says, "I'm not going to let you go until you bless me." Okay, and so he touches Jacob's hip and messes up his hip, causes his hip to come out of joint or something like that. And he still holds on. And finally, the angel says, "You're no longer going to be called Jacob, but you're going to be called Israel." Okay, so Jacob, he asked him, "What's your name?" Jacob. Jacob means, anybody remember? Yeah. Usurper, supplanter, deceiver. That's who Jacob was up to this point. But now he's going to be Israel. And so names you see this identity shift, at least in the story, from Jacob to Israel, when you think of all that a name is. And so he blesses them. He says, "You're no longer going to be Jacob, you're going to be Israel." And at this point, we begin to really see favorable changes in Jacob's attitude, because what he's going to do as he faces the fear of meeting his brother is he's going to pray. And that's maybe take a few moments to look at that in the next chapter. But anyway, the angel blesses them. Jacob limps. From this point forward, this is going to serve as a memorial, if you will, of his wrestling with God. And he's going to cross the river, and he and his family are going to meet Esau on the next day. So I saw a couple hands. Philip, start with you, brother.
Yeah, one thing clear, we've had all these discussions about Jacob's character, his flaws, things like that, but he is beginning to grow in his faith. But clearly, he has strong faith in God already, because he's going back to meet his brother who's about ready, or he thinks, to kill him.
Mm-hmm.
So he's afraid, but he is doing what God has told him to do. He's moving forward with that. He could stay right back, or gone somewhere else to get away from Laban. But he is going where God told him to go.
Right. And that was the promise that God said back in, I think, in verse 31. Let me look real quick. Yeah, the Lord said to Jacob, and this is while he's still with Laban, "Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you." So again, what does it come down to? The same thing we saw with Abraham, faith, right? So God said, go. God said, I'll be with you. Jacob needs to go. And truthfully, should he be afraid? No. God said he's going to be with him. God's made the promise. But with that being said, I mean, this is reality. This is real life. And we know how faith and fear can be mixed together. And we see Jacob demonstrating both of those. But the fact that there is faith there shows progression in his growth as a person and his walk with the Lord. Luke?
Verse 20 of chapter 32, behold, your servant Jacob also is behind us, for he said, I will appease his face at the present that goes before me. That word appease is the same Hebrew word as the word for atonement. And so, connecting that with Leviticus chapter 1 and just understanding that word, I hope that we can see in this passage that Esau and Jacob are at odds. There is a division between them, and now we see Jacob coming back, trying to make things right.
Right.
And so we see him get sinning again, sinning another again, another again. We see this appeasement.
Mm-hmm.
He's seeking atonement.
Right.
He's seeking reconciliation. And so that verse 20, I will appease his face with the present that goes before me. Then after I will see his face, perhaps he will lift up my eyes.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sermon that way.
Mm-hmm.
As far as what has happened to his face.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important for us to see the idea of atonement being made and the reconciliation that happens from atonement.
Right. And certainly the applications, the sermon being the applications as it pertains to our relationship with God, you know, and Jesus Christ being the means by which our atonement is made, and we're able to then have peace with God. You can't just build that bridge back. You know, God builds that bridge back through Jesus, and we embrace that in faith and service to the Lord. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's really interesting to see how the word
Yeah.
face
Yeah. Deep salvation stuff from Genesis. Thanks, Luke. Crawford? Mm-hmm.
So we enter to God, or they enter in with God through that. But I think that also teaches something. Jacob is appeasing Esau in the same way he would of God. I don't think he's saying Esau is a God, but I do think that points to his humility in this moment.
But yeah, that's an interesting statement, because when he gets to Esau, you remember what he says? Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God. So I mean, I don't know if there's any connection between that, but just you said he's kind of treating it as he might, you know, but that's how he makes that statement, and that, you know, we could talk about that, but yeah, I think that's a respectful title, not like God Lord, but a title of respect. And we see Jacob repeatedly trying to show honor to his brother, because he knows he didn't leave on good terms, and he know he didn't do his brother right. So, you know, despite Jacob's fear, they are able to meet, and it seems like Esau has put the past behind them. They embrace one another with tears. They're restored. Esau says, hey, what's all this stuff? Why'd you send it? And he says, it's for you. He says, I've got plenty, I don't need it. And Jacob says, no, please take it. So Esau ends up taking it. And he says, hey, let me escort you back home. And you know, Jacob doesn't, he might be reconciled, but he still doesn't fully trust his brother. He says, no, we're slow, we've got young ones, we've got cattle. Y'all go on ahead, we'll be there later. Okay, and so he refuses the escort. Apparently that's what the 400 men were to act as an escort to bring Jacob safely back home. But anyway, they're able to be reconciled. And after Jacob arrives back home, he purchases Shechem, he builds an altar, and he calls it God, the God of Israel. And this really marks a turning point in Jacob's life, where God has been with him to bring him safely back and fulfill his word and keep that covenant promise to him. And we see Jacob's faith really growing in these last couple of chapters, his confidence and his trust in the Lord. Lance? Yes. Yeah. Is that chapter 32? Yeah. Yeah. Lay down on a rock and slept. Mm-hmm. It truly is, and I wish we had more time to talk about that. I wish we had more time to talk about Esau, because I find Esau, the transformation that's taking place. We talk about Jacob's transformation. Esau's made a transformation, okay? Because this is not the same Esau that we met whenever Jacob left. Okay, he's forgiven his brother, and Jacob hasn't done anything to really apologize, at least from his understanding. I know we're just about time, Luke.
Verse 8, verse 10, verse 15, and after atonement, trying to thank God, which we know from the common usage today, I think it's important for us to understand the cross. Our favor with God, the peace with God, has to be preceded by atonement. So you